enthusiasts and relaxation seekers. My name is Cinephile ASMR, and the day has finally arrived. It is time to actually talk and review Spider-Man No Way Home, baby. Let's go! Quick disclaimer before we get into this video. There will be chunks and little timestamps that will be put into this video as to really show you what will be spoiler-free, a spoiler discussion, and so much more. So, don't worry, the first part of this video will be spoiler-free. Take my word on it. And then later on, if you have seen the video or come back after you have seen the film, watch the spoiler part because it's going to be juicy, guys. As many of you know, if you have followed my channel for some time now, Spider-Man is the most iconic character in the world, practically. But for me, it means everything. Without the character of Spider-Man in my life, I wouldn't be following the principles and ideals that I put myself through day in and day out. This has been someone who was introduced to me with my father giving me his DVDs when I was like 4 or 5 and watching them in my room that I used to share with my sister in a bunk bed on a box TV. I would watch the living crap out of the Raimi trilogy. They taught me benchmark ideas and fundamental human pillars for who I am, such as becoming myself, owning up to every decision you make, realizing that mistakes and failure are a part of the process amidst so much more. And I was very fortunate because this passion was evident in my day-to-day life, and luckily I was never taken down for that or burdened with bullying or people judging me for that, while others in this world for feeling such strong, adamant feelings towards such before the MCU and comic books became so popularized were torn down for that. And it sucks. It really sucks. But I grew up, luckily, not having that experience, but instead there was other demons and wars that I had to wage. But it was difficult at a young age for some very specific reasons, and Spider-Man was the thing that I latched on to the greatest and the heaviest. I watched not only the Raimi trilogy, but when the web films with Andrew Garfield came out, I found a strong connection with those as well. Each of the films that have progressively come out have had varying distinct styles, techniques, approaches, themes, messages, but I've extracted something from all of them, from being 4 to 5 and my father gifting me them, to growing up with those ideals in mind. Peter Parker as a character is someone that I will never forget. He's a guy who's been gifted otherworldly abilities, and because of one spider bite, he has to question every single action microscopically every single day of his life. And for a lot of us, even though none of us have been bit by a radioactive spider that has given us the ability to spin webs from our arms or hang from buildings or crawl on walls, we are bit by the bug of life, of adulthood, of responsibility. And as Uncle Ben, as Cliff Robertson tells Tobey Maguire in the first Spider-Man right before he goes to get the $3,000 from the wrestling match, with great power comes great responsibility. And that line has been told throughout the history of time, but it's because of Spider-Man that it's so popular and it means such a great deal. It's a very understandable passage, but when you apply it to real life, we are given responsibilities day in and day out, and with every one of them comes the ability to go right or wrong. And it's knowing that each of our actions have an incredible footprint and ramifications, that we better go out with the best intentions. And Spider-Man is just a pure beacon of hope and light. He is a person, and it's a reason why he's the most popular comic book character, because of how much he means to everyone in this world. I know for some it might seem it doesn't feel as important to them or personal because it's so popular, but trust me when I tell you, having your Spider-Man like it did for me growing up will change you as it did for me. I will never be the same without Peter Parker, without Sam Raimi's trilogy, without Tobey Maguire's perfection of a performance, how he's able to embody a person who's saying so much with very minimal words. And then dig into Mark Webb's films, how Andrew Garfield is able to transcend all of these charismatic abilities and what I do believe to be the greatest Peter Parker Spider-Man portrayal, although he's not in my favorite movies, which are bloated and filled with studio interference. Andrew Garfield is such a shining spot in them, and his relationship with Gwen and what that means, it's one of the most powerful things ever brought to screen. Growing up, I've been able to experience all of them, and although I do have a lot of issues, which I will get into later with Tom Holland's first two Spider-Man films, I still appreciate them. And that's the thing, going into this film, I was able to rewatch all of these films, and it was such a beautiful reminder as I did distance myself without even realizing from what Spider-Man means to me. And I took a step back because life was life and adulthood was adulthood, and watching these films again for the 100th time was a telling tale for me into fully understanding what these messages, themes, and symbols mean as a older person. And I was so excited going into No Way Home, but I was very petrified because I do have issues. I think John Watts is a great filmmaker, and I love the creative team behind it. I think Tom Holland is an incredible actor, but there is a sort of reliance to the MCU timeline, and its reliance on making Tony Stark the father figure I can acknowledge and respect, but I was very worried. It does seem very Tony Stark-centric, like Peter Parker's fighting the scraps. I'm not the biggest fan of how they've evolved, or lack thereof, of Aunt May, paired with a lot of other factors. I was quite apprehensive, but I went into this movie. I was very, very, very fortunate enough to get a screener for Wednesday before it released for this event hosted by the TikTok famous individual by the name of Soups, and it was amazing. We got there, my friend and I got there an hour and a half early. There was already hundreds of people in line. The anticipation was insane. Costumes were beautiful, smiles were shown, laughter was loud, and the energy was palpable. You could cut it with a knife and it would just be gushing out. I dressed up in my emo Peter Parker symbiote suit, and I was ecstatic, but I was also very, very, very nervous. What if this movie didn't live up to the insurmountable expectations? But I mean, when you label and market a film that has all of these characters returning from these universes, paired with all of the leaks that have come out, whether or not they're true, I was nervous. I was shivering practically. It was also cold that day. So I went in within that premiere. I sat in the auditorium. People were cheering even before the movie came out and was on the screen. What did I think? Well, Spider-Man No Way Home does follow directly after the events of Far From Home, after Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, leaks Spider-Man's identity with Peter Parker. It happens mere seconds. It literally could be handed off like a baton from the moment Far From Home ends, the moment No Way Home begins. And that's the first thing that caught me off guard, was how fast-paced this movie was. And that did leave me a little skeptical. I thought it was going to be rushed. I thought it was going beat for beat without just moment seeking and just letting it seep into the veins. But I was cautiously optimistic. I kept going. I was persistent, and I kept watching. And from there, I was given one of the most emotionally satisfying experiences I've ever seen in a movie. It has been the best Spider-Man experience I have watched since Spider-Man 2, back when I was 4 or 5 years old. It brought me to tears just thinking about all of the things that Spider-Man means to me. I'm not going to try to get emotional. I'm really not. But I have never felt the way that I felt in that auditorium. I was brought down to my knees, down to my most inner core, because of how emotionally resonant this film was. There is so much to discuss, and I'm very, very excited to delve into it with you guys, because it's basically what I've been waiting for a decade plus. A movie that is able to make Peter Parker, brought down to his most vulnerable, beat him senseless physically and mentally, while also serving as an emotionally resonant story and a nice way to showcase the actor who plays Spider-Man's acting amid so much more. And it comes in full swing, it comes in punching, it comes in giving you a 1-2 Italian uppercut, like Muhammad Ali came right onto the stage, and it was in his prime. I was not expecting this movie to hit on the capacity in which it did, but oh my goodness, I'm standing here right now, and it's been a long time. I'll get into why it's been a bit of a distance, because I need a time to process. You know, it's very easy for me to have been able to make a video Wednesday night, post it Thursday, get some nice views from it, probably better than this video will. But this channel wasn't built for views, guys. I need you to know that. It wasn't built for clout or notoriety because of instant upload. It was built off of quality, you know? Views are nice, recognition is great, that's like the nice hors d'oeuvres, the nice appetizer, but the meal is quality. And I needed to think about this movie because it is so dense in terms of being a Spider-Man fan and all the things it does. So what does the film get right? Well, first of all, as I said in the other two Spider-Man films with Tom Holland, one of my biggest issues is how it needs to stick so close to the MCU timeline. And it wasn't until the rewatches of every single Spider-Man film that I came to the realization of something pretty important, which is, for me at least, the thing about the Raimi trilogy and the two Mark Webb films, for as bloated and messy as they are, they feel very close, very isolated within a universe of their own. They have a very strong identity regardless of their issues, regardless of how bloated they can feel. They have their own strong identity. And when you have a film like the first two Tom Holland Spider-Man films that are ingrained into the MCU, I feel the biggest issue arises in the fact that you have a sandbox filled with every single character that they can extract. And when they do so, I feel it feels like less of a Spider-Man movie and more of an MCU film with Spider-Man. And that's the issue that I had especially with Far From Home. It did not feel like Peter's battle being fought with Quentin Beck. Quentin Beck's issues were in line with Tony Stark's technology, calling it barf. Like, the more I think about it, the more insanely stupid it is. But this isn't, it's just, oh gosh, on top of the fact that, like, Edith, this piece of technology after Ultron, Tony made and gave it to a teenage boy instead of, like, Bruce Banner. Okay, I'm not getting into that. But what I'm trying to say is the thing that one really caught me off guard, along with so much more, was how, as otherworldly and multi-dimensional as No Way Home gets, is evident in the trailer, with the inclusion of Doctor Strange, the different multiverses, this movie feels very close. There is a heart at the central hub of this film regarding Tom Holland's Spider-Man, Ned, MJ, and it sticks with that. But even as it gets crazy and wacky, the movie stays in New York City. It stays within its own confines. And it wasn't until I saw Far From Home where I realized New York is practically a character of itself within the Spider-Man film. It is a very packed, diverse cultural area that Spider-Man grows up in. He's very poor. He doesn't have much money, but when you take Spider-Man out of the city in which makes him him, you lose a lot of that authenticity. And this movie does stay in New York. It is very understanding within its limits, and I found that to be very awesome and just a freaking reminder to me that Spider-Man and New York work in tandem together, not apart. And when they do, you suffer. And I really, really, really have to give credit to John Watts here. You will hear a lot of arguments and debates being spun by the fact John Watts doesn't really have much of a distinct style comparatively to Webb and Raimi. But when watching this film, I came to a really unique understanding, which is, first of all, that isn't a fair argument to be had, because both Raimi and Webb had films that came before it, very stylized films. Watts did make one film called Cop Car before, which is really good, but it didn't really show off much of a style. It was really well directed, but with Webb, you have 500 Days of Summer before he did the two Spider-Man films, and that film is heavily stylized and relies heavily on a relationship between two partners. So obviously that bleeds into the TASM films, and then with Raimi, he was made known for the Evil Dead trilogy with his horror, with his style, with his zany wackiness, and that bled through into the Raimi trilogy. But it's unfair for Watts to be put on that same pedestal. He was made sketches and comedies, shorts beforehand in the early 2000s, and then Cop Car, but it's not fair. Now with this movie though, there is a lot to enjoy. I'm not saying the entire film, every shot is gushing with style. I do think that there is some issues when it comes to the dialogue and the shot reverse shot. It feels a lot more unorganic and just very lackluster, but it does its job. Now it comes to the action. Oh my goodness. There is several fight scenes in this movie that go buck wild, particularly one in between the second and third acts where they're in an apartment building, and although the set design isn't really amazing or isn't very memorable, like it doesn't feel lived in because it's so modern and high priced. I'll be getting into the spoiler section area where I talk more about that. I felt the action was top notch. It was freaking brutal, and that does also lend itself to the acting on display in this film, which I will also be getting into. But the fight scenes and the choreography and the way the camera moves in a lot of it, you feel the weight of every punch, and there is plenty of them. And it's not just to say that that part is amazing. The finale on the Statue of Liberty, as shown in the trailers, oh my gosh, the highway fight between Doc Ock and Peter Parker, it's insane, it's beautiful. And on top of that, one of my biggest prayers that I thought would never be answered in any Marvel movie was the fact that this movie has freaking color. It looks gorgeous in so many scenes. It doesn't look gray, flat, muted like so much of the Marvel movies do. And this is coming from a guy, if you've seen my review of Shang-Chi, you know I love that movie, nothing but praise. But that final battle is ugly as sin. It is so gray, it is so flat. It's like you took tar, mud, and cement and rubbed it all over the screen. It's gross. But this movie, no. It literally said, hold my beer, and it went full send on the color. You have so much vibrancy in that one shot. Oh my gosh, I got chills just thinking about it. That one shot where Peter's standing in the rain, there's neon lights around him, on top of the fact of how emotionally resonant that part is, knowing what happens. Spoiler talk, not getting into it yet. Beautiful. It was fully aware of the potential that color has. And I know it's a bit of a small detail, but when you've had most of your MCU filled with drab, ugly colors, I'm gonna take it when I can, man. I'm gonna feast on it, and it gave me a lot to consume. Really though, direction, action, color grading, music by Giacchino is all amazing. But how is the story? You know, you can have amazing additions, but if the core of a film doesn't work, there's no point. And that's where this movie really set it home for me, knocked it out of the park. I mean, you have the multiverse stuff with Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Electro, Lizard, and Sandman, which is a lot in a movie. But it's this idea that the writers went with, and the fact that this movie wasn't the primary idea immediately after the film of Far From Home. It was originally going to be Peter Parker on the Run, Kraven the Hunter story that was a lot smaller comparatively to the multiverse that we got. The fact that this movie works so well really just flabbergasts me, and my hat has to go off to the two writers of this film. I believe their names are Chris McKenna and Eric Summers. They did amazing. They did it so justice, because you have these characters, and my biggest fear, this isn't a Mysterio illusion like I was so concerned about. It's really well done, and the fact that they fully go for it, and that's another big thing, is there is full commitment to this film. There isn't an idea that's half-baked. No, they go 110% They just don't go 100, 90, 80, 70. They go 110. They fully committed. They own their choices. And that's something that I feel a lot of films outside of the MCU, outside of Spider-Man, lack, is they set up these ideas, but they don't fully go for it. And this film commits on every level, and the multiverse is at the forefront of it. You have all of these characters, but at the head of it all, with the multiverse, is the idea that Spider-Man does not want to feed into this mentality, into this cyclical area of making these villains die because they are villains as such. And that idea of Peter wanting to just rewrite the wrongs that they have committed by saving them, all of them, is something that is utterly fascinating but so true to Peter Parker as a character. He goes against what people say, what the easy route would be, and challenges himself, because with great power comes great responsibility. Now, it is a choice, though, that will serve him in a lot of ways, for better and for worse. There is consequences in this movie, and I will talk much more heavily about it in the spoiler discussion. I really love certain aspects of it, and I think in the grander umbrella of schemes, it makes the character of Peter Parker challenge that much more, and is the catalyst for what will happen after the fact. But I feel there is a lot the movie doesn't do within the trilogy to really make the weight of it go. And in my spoiler discussion, I will also really note the one thing that I do love about this movie, though, but it does make me a little melancholic. Now, I will say, though, Peter Parker in this movie is brought down to his utter core. He is angry. He is revenge-filled. He isn't perfect. He's a kid, for God's sake. And because of that, he goes about all of these decisions as Spider-Man. But when the consequences start rolling in, that's when you feel the weight of Tom Holland as a performer. Everyone in this movie is great. I don't think there is a bad actor in it. I will say the first 10 or so, maybe 20 minutes before Tom Holland Spider-Man Peter goes to the Sanctum Sanctorum and talks with Strange, before that moment, I thought it was a little wishy-washy. I felt the MCU humor was going a bit too hard, and I was at first worried because there is that scene on the rooftop and Peter and MJ are having a great moment, and then Ned interacts, and I was like, oh, really? But then I realized this is the three of their stories. This is them together as one unit, and the movie goes for it in that regard, which I did appreciate. But from that moment on, from the Sanctum Sanctorum, when the multiverse gets erupted and all hell breaks loose, that's when this movie picks up, and it is like stairs. It gradually gets better, and I would much rather have a movie slowly get the steam, and then by the end it is freaking Thomas the Tank Engine going down the train tracks, versus the opposite where it loses steam towards the end. It is a progression that every scene is amplified. It isn't like steps and then one falters. No, it is a constant uphill. Beautiful, and it's strung by Tom Holland's performance. He gives the best performance of his damn career. Not beating around the bush here. He literally gives arguably one of the best Spider-Man performances, because there is a lot he has to juggle. There is a lot of weight and emotion tied to it all, and he does absolutely spellbinding work. I absolutely could not believe it. I was blown away, and this is the Peter Parker that I have been waiting for, the man who has a lot of responsibilities to deal with and isn't uplifted by these characters in a way that makes it seem as if his decisions are not his own, but his along with others, in a very non-balanceable way. And that idea that was introduced in Homecoming, where being a teenager or being the Spider-Man that his powers give him, was danced around, but on a very surface level, where it was him and the debate club, I believe, and he could either go hang out with them or be Spider-Man, and that was great, but it should have been grown on. And in Far From Home, it was brought down to either hanging out with MJ or being Spider-Man, and I just felt like that decision just was stagnant. But in this movie, the decisions are life-threatening, and it's crazy. The stakes have never been higher, and it is beautiful. And I haven't even talked about the villains in this movie. as Dr. Otto Octavius. There's nobody that could ever replace him. Jamie Foxx, I did really enjoy. I had a lot of fun with him. And he is, Jamie Foxx, he's one of the coolest, most suave individuals alive. His energy just radiates, no pun intended, get it, because, Electro. I feel like a joke isn't really funny when you have to say the meaning behind it. Anyway, I just felt it was great, but Willem Dafoe, this man has aged like fine wine, physically that handsome individual. He has proven himself to be one of the greatest actors standing, one of the most misunderstood in terms of the Academy and getting Oscar recognition, but he is churning out brilliant works of art every single performance. And I would argue, catch me on a certain day, I would say that this is his best performance above Spider-Man 1. He is menacing, he's vicious, he's relentless, he's ruthless. And the way that he challenges Peter Parker and the way Tom Holland is able to bounce off of Willem Dafoe's insanity was beautiful. But the one thing I was not expecting was the fact of how they approached his reality, his humanity. And it doesn't start with his craziness. In fact, it starts with a lot more of his humanity than it turns into the Green Goblin we know. And as such, you want to freaking beat the living crap out of Green Goblin, because in many ways it is him as the main villain, and then Otto in some unique ways, and I'll talk more about how they go about that in the spoiler portion. But this movie was insanity. It was insanity. Now I would say, when it is all said and done, at the end of the day, when this movie has its big finale, its big showdown with all of these characters, with all the sacrifices, losses, painted in beautiful colors, composed eloquently by Michael Giacchino, helmed by a director at his greatest potential, with John Watts really feeling in his element, comfortable after 3 films. The biggest surprise to me, I expected to cry at certain moments, which I did. I expected to feel chills, goosebumps, head to toe, which I did. What I was not expecting was to feel so emotionally connected to the way in which they go about finalizing this film's and the home trilogy's approach to Peter Parker, to Tom Holland Spider-Man, a Spider-Man that I felt very difficult to latch onto because of the MCU-ness, because of their approach to the film, because a lot of his decisions in both early films felt there was no consequence attached to both. So with that in mind, the ending of this movie felt like it was reserved, it was mature, and it was approached in a way that I don't think I could have properly made any better. It felt like the Peter Parker that was left in Spider-Man with Raimi, with Garfield, and I couldn't have been happier. It sends Peter off to college in a very beautiful way, along with MJ and Ned. It was so mature, and I saw some genuine growth, and that is a big theme in this movie, which is growth, progression, evolution, connection. And I was stunned. I was really freaking taken back by how they were wrapping it all up. This is a trilogy that I have a very tumultuous relationship with. I really enjoy aspects of Homecoming. I don't like Far From Home, but this movie made me feel a sense of progression from the moment we met Peter in Civil War to where we end in No Way Home. It was beautiful. I found myself crying most from his stuff, from Peter Parker's Tom Holland, or Tom Holland's Peter Parker, and I just, honestly, this is coming from a guy who's never really loved him very much. Now, I hope you understand that, because it means all the more when I say this is the best Spider-Man movie since Spider-Man 2. It has emotion, it has depth, it's cohesive, and with everything it packs on, with all of the villains, with the multiverse stuff, including Doctor Strange, while also keeping that core of Peter, MJ, and Ned. Their story is prevalent throughout all the twists, throughout all the surprises of the film. This movie keeps them at the forefront, and it works. There's a beating heart amongst all 3 of them, and there's scenes that, when it has them, there is so much emotion and depth. I'm just thinking about it in my head right now, and I can't even believe how they were able to do it. I can't. I was fully prepared to set up this camera, the lights, write my notes, and hate this movie. I really was. I'm not a cynic. I'm not. But I've just been conditioned through the past two movies to be disappointed. And if you go in expecting disappointment, you can't be disappointed. Seriously though, I love this movie so freaking much, and I think that's gonna wrap up the spoiler-free portion of this section. There'll be a recap where I give my final grade, but I would love to discuss spoilers. So if you're still here, you might want to skedaddle if you haven't seen the movie, and then come back when you have, because we've got some juicy stuff to talk about. So I'm going to discuss spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Charlie Cox Daredevil's back. Charlie Cox Daredevil's back. Charlie Cox Daredevil's back. Charlie Cox Daredevil's back. La da da da. La da da da. I was okay. So there needs to be a discussion to be had tied to this. A lot of people complain. A lot of people banter. A lot of people argue over the fact that these movies, especially the MCU Spider-Man, especially this, is heavily filled with CGI. A lot of those backdrops look like they're just standing in sort of green or blue screens. It doesn't look practical. To that, I would agree, but to that I would serve a counter. All the people who leaked images, who went about spoiling films, spoiling this movie, leaking images for what? Clout, instantaneous, retweets, boosts, traction. You are scum. You are literal scum of the earth because you ruin experiences for people. A lot of people say that it was all calculated, that it was all planned to leak all this stuff. I don't agree whatsoever because, sure, maybe a smaller movie leaking stuff here and there, but this is literally Spider-Man No Way Home, where the prospect of Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield being in it is enough to send people fleeing to the theaters. But you still freaking leaked it. And because of that, got a few things spoiled for me. And I wasn't even trying. People weren't even hiding it at this point. It was just there. And one of them was Charlie Cox's Daredevil being in the movie. But his introduction was great. It was still surprising. His walking stick and then him coming into frame was just gorgeous in that moment when the brick flies through the window and it says Mysterio was right. He catches it. Amazing. Loved it. Love his haircut. I'm so happy Charlie Cox is back, but it does leave me a little nervous and apprehensive that they won't stick with that same gritty tone that the Netflix show has. And I'm a little nervous, but I'm gonna take it right now. Take my victories. I'm so happy they didn't recast it. So that's amazing. Now, I wonder what else I could talk about. Oh yeah, Aunt May dies. So I'm not even gonna lie. When I saw that scene, perhaps it was tied within the fact that we just saw Green Goblin frickin' body Peter, and he's like holding him by the head, and oh dude, I have chills. And perhaps it's like Tom Holland screaming and pleading to May to go, to run. It got me. But what further got me was with the great power comes great responsibility line. Oh my god, I'm getting chills. That's like the early stage of me about to cry. But when she says that, I'm not even gonna lie to you, I broke down because one of my biggest issues, and I didn't want to talk about this in my spoiler-free portion because it was going to be brought up here, was the fact that the MCU Spider-Man films don't bring up any mention of Ben Parker. The only time I think they did was within the briefcase that Peter was given on his trip, and it had his initials, that's it. And I was so frustrated at those two movies for it. I was so angry because I get it. Both the Raimi and the Webb films went over that. They had Uncle Ben, they had him die. But at least give him a mention, use him as somewhat of a backbone. And then I felt if this movie were to introduce him and discuss about Ben Parker's significance in Aunt May and Peter's life, it would have felt just tacked on way too late. But this movie, as I said, fully commits to its ideas, and it basically makes Aunt May the Uncle Ben figure, which made so much sense considering the route that they were going on. They fully committed, and I adored that decision because not only does it add any unnecessary weight, but it makes the character, who's not my favorite, somewhat lackluster. It just doesn't hold that same sort of intimacy and nurturing side that Rosemary Harris in the Raimi trilogy or Sally Fields does, but she was still really freaking good. I do have issue because the other two films don't set up the weight or the effort to make that moment as emotional as possible, and as I do somewhat nitpick that, I kind of wish she did say a bit more after the fact. I still take it. I'll still take it. And I thought it was great. And you have Tom Holland. He says something like, "Wake up now." Like, wake up. And it was, oh my God. I'm not gonna cry. It was so emotionally rich. And it was so sad. And then when Happy's just like, "Peter, run." And the fact that the cops or whatever, people with guns come in and just shoot Peter up, a boy who just lost his aunt after he lost his parents. It's insane, but it further sort of builds into that end of him being on his own. And then you have one of my favorite scenes in any Spider-Man film ever. If you told me I would have said that about this movie going into the film, I would have freaking kicked you. But that moment where he's watching the big jumbotron screen of J. Jonah Jameson in the rain with the neon lights, and he's crying, and J. Jonah was like, "Everything Spider-Man touches turns to ruin." I lost it, because that's the Peter Parker that I wanted so bad, because a protagonist is great, and if they're written well, that's amazing. But when they're thrusted into otherworldly situations because of their otherworldly circumstances, and they're beaten to a bloody pulp, I just get so much satisfaction out of that. When they're challenged, like Peter was in this film, I lose it. And it was gorgeous, man. It was absolutely gorgeous. But before then, oh my gosh, and I was talking about that fight scene with Green Goblin and Peter in the apartment, and although I do feel the sets are not very memorable, that's, that part when Peter, he whips onto the ground and punches with his feet Green Goblin into like 2 stories below. I was like, that's some Insomniac Spider-Man PS4 crap. And I went, in that moment, oh my God, I rent-free moment amongst many, when he whips onto the roof, and then he gets on top of Green Goblin and is punching him, and you just see a smile start to form with every hit. That's when I realized Willem Dafoe is at the greatest he's ever been, and it reminded me of that moment in BVS when Clark and Bruce are fighting, and Bruce is hitting at the end with fighting, and he's punching Clark, and what's like for once impacting him, he just freezes back up because he has all of his strength. I lost it. It was insane, and there's so many beautiful moments like that, and it really does come down to how great of the execution it all was, and the CGI just looks so freaking good. I loved it. And I didn't even talk about, how they were introduced. It was so well. Whether it be through Otto Octavius and how they used him as an ally, which makes total sense considering the fact that all of these characters are evil to some degree. But with Otto, he had the best intentions. He wanted the Tritium to build a self-sustaining sun, and his intentions and his heart was in the right place. But out of every of these characters, he's the one that has the most humanity, so it makes sense for him to be sort of this guide into what Peter is experiencing with the multiverses, all these characters. And that moment when he gets back himself, he's like, the voice is so quiet. I cried so hard. And then he's talking to Norman, and Norman's like, "Is that really you?" And he's like, "Yes, my friend, it's me. It's been so long." I was like, it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. And although, you know, there is clearly favorites amongst those two, and then you would have Electro, and then you would have the Lizard and Sandman, they were all having their day in court. It was great. And I guess I gotta talk about it. You know, you can't really talk spoilers without talking about the thing. Okay. So, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield are in this movie. On countless moments, countless scenes, when they were on screen, I was crying. I was flabbergasted. I was floored. I couldn't believe it. But most importantly, I was so happy they were done right. That was the one thing I was going into this film expecting, was for them to be in this movie, but more so I was just wanting them to be given justice. You can have actors as bodies in a movie, but if they're not given right justice or treatment, there's no point. But that moment when Ned and MJ are at Ned's house and he's opening the portal, and then you see the back, because Andrew Garfield's a very distinguishable figure in terms of his stature. I was like, there's no way. There's no way. And then he jumps in. Gotta go down as one of the biggest crowd-pleasing moments of all time. Cap picking up Thor's hammer. Avengers Assemble. Who? I don't even... That's like small fry. That's like you saw that movie on a Sunday afternoon with like a couple of old fogies back in... Who says fogies? A couple of old people in like the back of an auditorium. I love you old people though. You old people are awesome. But I'm just saying, you know, they're not going to be cheering. So that part was insane. And then they're like, okay, let's try it again. And then Tobey come. When I saw Tobey, that was one of the best moments of my entire life. That is my Spider-Man. That'll be forever my Spider-Man. I owe that character my life. I owe him my life. I owe Raimi my life. And I saw him and I lost it. He looks so good. They all look so good. And I think by having them be introduced within Ned and MJ, and I fully expected them to be introduced during the final fight, but they were given room to breathe and have some moments together beforehand. I lost it. I went nuts. And every moment that one of them was talking, I was like pinching myself. I was just so insanely blown away by the fact that they actually are in this movie. It is only something that you kind of say to yourself as like a fan cast, as like an idea, but it's in the movie. They're in the film, and they have these back and forths, and they are their own characters. They're not MCU. They are their own Sonyverse, respectfully. Like, it was just, and their banter back and forth, and then it just makes it even more so after the fact. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. And then comes arguably one of the best scenes I've ever watched in my entire life. One scene that I will never forget. One scene that when I die on my deathbed, I'm going to be thinking about. And that is when, and okay, for a split second, I thought that they were going to go to the cemetery when they were like, oh, where's a place that he goes to escape where no one else knows. I really thought they were going to show like Ben Parker's like gravestone, but I'm glad they didn't. Further goes for how I feel they fully committed to their ideas. But he's on top of the school, which I actually thought was a really beautiful moment, to be quite frank. Which I really thought was so freaking good. And that shot of Tobey and Andrew just hanging, and you see their silhouettes. And it's not even, okay, so it isn't even that part particularly, but that moment before where Peter, he doesn't even look to MJ or Ned. He just knows they're there, and they hold on to him, and he just lets it all out. But it was just this idea, because then they start crying, and it was that moment where you realize, you know, they're gonna be friends forever. in some capacity, even though the ending is the ending. They're going to be soulmates and best friends forever. And it was that idea that this isn't like a Peter and MJ movie with Ned shoehorned in as like the comic relief. It's all three of them. And that was the moment that I realized that's when that scene earlier on in the beginning of the film where he interrupts like their moment together was deserved, because it's their movie. And it was I was a goner by then. And then they come down and they all talk about what they lost. And Peter is so stuck within the belief that it's his fault, that that was his doing. And without that, this would have been all undone. And like Andrew, and then Peter, and Toby, it's just so hard to properly articulate to the degree and magnitude that that moment signifies. How they're talking about their Uncle Ben's, and how that is so similar to the Aunt May for Tom's Peter. And I gotta say, I love Toby in this movie. I loved him and I thought he was fantastic. Just that same tender, sweet boy that he was in the Raimi trilogy. But Andrew Garfield stole the show. I am sorry to say, for all of the Tobey Maguire stans who are looking forward to it, he's amazing. He really is. I'm not trying to understate that. But there is something about the amount of commitment and full send that Andrew Garfield goes for. And it does, and it makes sense. And in a lot of ways, this movie is the get out of jail free card for Sony. They screwed over Tobey's film and Andrew's film. Although you could argue that Spider-Man 3 does have a strong sense of closure. It is him and MJ having their last dance and it fades to black. It's beautiful. There was going to be a fourth film. They gave Raimi a sense of false hope that he could be able to make his fourth film. And he didn't. He couldn't. And then you had Webb's films, which opened the door and it was not complete. So this, of course, made sense for Andrew's Peter to be given much attention. And it was amazing. And that's something, it's the fact that, like, they were given so much more screen time and so much more attention. They had their quips. I love the back-cracking thing. Is the Avengers, is that a band? I thought it was great. None of it. The freaking meme. They did the meme. Yes. It was amazing. It was amazing. It was amazing. It was amazing. But what they did for all of them in terms of the emotional resonance, amazing. I can't. Oh, and then speaking of amazing, like the whole self-talk thing where it's like, I feel like this is like some sort of thing going on. He's like, you are amazing. Say it. You are amazing. I was like, what? Are you kidding me? Toby's giving Andrew therapy. This is beautiful. But it comes down to that thing with Andrew. He killed Gwen. He did. He let her die. And it wasn't purposeful, but it happened. And it keeps with that trauma, you know. He's feeling like you can't have a life, a relationship as Spider-Man. You have to pick one or the other. And it's how he was able to get out of that, rise above the ashes by saving MJ. And he's crying, which showed me, and it makes me so happy that this movie exists, if anything, to show as a means to make TASM 3. And there might be a possibility. I mean, the amount of outpouring that social media has had with hashtag #MakeTASM3, outstanding, insanity. It's beautiful. But they weren't given the best amount of justice that I possibly could imagine. 100%, unequivocally. And that final battle was terrific. It was so well handled, so well executed. Peter 1, Peter 2, Peter 3, their little conversation beforehand, it was just handled with such care and masterful craftsmanship, from Watts to the writers, to the camera operator, to the composer. It was just amazing, amazing stuff. And there's so many adjectives I could describe with this movie. It just really took me by surprise. I was not expecting it to be as beautiful as it was. I loved me the fight scene. I loved me the grand climax. The thing that I loved even more, though, was how Peter, in such a selfless act, told Strange to undo the spell by making everyone forget about him. And it lent for one of the best moments moments in the entire film, in the entire Holland trilogy, and in terms of big blockbusters, I've never felt more emotion because it wasn't based off of nostalgia. And I would argue the only thing that I can really chalk up to nostalgia bait, maybe the great power comes great responsibility thing, but I felt like all of it worked. Yeah, all the interactions, like with Doc and Peter to Toby, I felt that it worked and it was done justice. And this moment that made me feel so much was isolated. It was on its own. It was built naturally. And it was when him and MJ are talking and she says, "I love you," and he's about to say, and she says, wait until you find me. And I was like, what the? It was so beautiful. It was so gorgeous. And it was the sunrise. They have their kiss. He hugs Ned, does the handshake, and then goes off. And he gets his apartment, his janky ass apartment, and he goes to meet them during the winter time, which was amazing. And she doesn't remember. I'm really happy that they held true to that. Full commitment, full send, and they really went for it, because I would have hated it so much, because there's no point if she remembered. It does nothing. And they didn't. This is Peter's time to find his own, to go into college on his own, a blank slate, a fresh start, a new him. And he gets into that apartment. He makes his own costume. It is classic era Spider-Man costume. He literally knits it together. He constructs it on his own, and he goes out. It was just, by that point I realized I had just watched one of the best Spider-Man films, because this is the Spider-Man that I know and love, not one that is aided by Stark tech, not one that is built and fighting the battles that aren't even his own. This is Peter Parker. And what that's going to ensue, I have no clue, but I have never felt more excited for where Spider-Man is going to go. I have never felt this happy for where this franchise can go next, where my Spider-Man, I can safely say that Tom Holland is my Spider-Man. I feel it in my bones now, the way that I felt about Raimi's and Webb's. I am just so filled with joy. And with that being said, all of it, I've talked your ear off today. I gotta give it an A+. I do. I have issues. I mean, there is the shot reverse shot, lazy sort of filmmaking when it comes to the dialogue in some instances. But I feel like so much of it gets thrown by the wayside when in the grand scheme of things, it has one of the strongest beating hearts in any major blockbuster that doesn't rely on nostalgia bait, or it doesn't rely on false promises, but it fully commits and revels within the world that it lives in. It gets crazy with the multiverse stuff. It gets even crazier with the reveals and twists, but at its heart, it keeps the main three, Ned, MJ, and Peter, at the forefront. It keeps them as the beating heart within it all. It puts them in otherworldly situations, but never forgets to give them time, while also giving some attention, strong attention, to the twists, the villains, and this idea that Peter does not want to continue the cycle of these villains dying because of who they are, because that's not who they are, and he tries to fix them. That's one of the craziest ideas I've ever heard in my entire life, and it freaking works. It works. This movie is so wild. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't get how they did it. I don't get how they were able to make everything work. Everything on top of it making an emotionally resonant story. And I guess just seeing this movie in a crowd, which, please be safe, because part of the reason why I haven't been uploading is because I did get COVID. I have COVID right now, and it completely screwed up all plans for Christmas. So be careful, be vaccinated. I feel without this vaccine, I would have been in a terrible position. I was sicker than a dog for the first few days, but I feel a lot better now. I'm still quarantining, doing my part, as you should do. But seeing a movie in a crowd, cheering as loud as they did, seeing it with my friend, watching it at a time in my life where we're in a time in everyone's life where we need this sense of unity, seeing it making so much money, it just feels right. This movie is right. I'm not saying in terms of right and wrong. I mean, it just feels right. simple as that. I can go on about every minor detail and how it works, the technicalities, but at the end of the day, they did it right. They did it. And I hope it did it for you too, the way that this movie changed me. I mean, I've been talking about this film for a long time, and I could still talk about it for lengths on end. And if you're still here, I love you so much. I can't wait to edit this. I can't wait to send it to you guys. I can't possibly think of how any other movie will make me feel on the same wavelength that No Way Home did. Because it is a movie. It is not built off of certain elements that would make a movie feel less of its own. It is its own beast, and I'm so happy that it exists. I'm so happy that it works, and I'm so happy it's connecting with so many people like it's connected with me. I can't wait to watch this movie going forward, and I love you all so, so much. Let me know what you thought of No Way Home down below. What is your favorite Spider-Man film? How would you rank all of them? What was your favorite aspect about it? And please be cordial and respectful for the people who have not seen this movie in the comments. I'm so happy to see where Tom Holland's Spider-Man is going to go next. I'm so happy to see where this channel is going to go next. Great art elicits great discussion. So just let me know, guys. I love you all so very much, and remember that with great power comes great responsibility, and of course, remember to take life one frame at a time.